Please be seated. We welcome everyone here, both in the church and in the infirmary, on TV and in Zoom land and wherever. And we're all here to remember Pat Kenoyer. We gather to remember with gratitude the long life of our sister in community, Pat Kenoyer, with these words of wisdom of Chief Tecumseh, who perhaps best reflect how she lived her life. So live your life that the fear of death can never enter your heart. Trouble no one about their religion. Respect others in their view and demand that they respect yours. Love your life. Beautify all things in your life. Seek to make your life long and its purpose in the service of others. Now let us listen to the biography of Pat's life.
Patricia Ann Kenoyer was born on Flag Day, and each of her 95 birthdays, she celebrated as though all the flags were flying for her. Her father, John J. Kenoyer of Leon, Kansas, met her mother, who was from El Dorado, Kansas, when the two arrived in Kansas City as very young adults. Grace Spalding Kenoyer was a registered nurse, so highly skilled that even in her 80s, she was invited back to the hospital to help out. John J. Kenoyer was a postal worker, a federal employee of great integrity, who worked the mail as it was being transported by train to each of the Midwestern cities. Pat had an older sister who died in infancy before Pat was born. The family lived in a newly developed residential area of Kansas City called Dutch Hill. The original ownership papers for 2544 Cherry, which came to the Sisters of Loretto when Pat inherited the property, specify a covenant by which homeowners agreed to exclude persons of color from ownership, tenancy, or even being present after dark. Pat began an autobiography in 1976 and updated it periodically. The rest of what I have is largely her story told her way. Dancing was my first profession. Not until I was 15 did I think of the real profession of my life, the Loretine one. As I grew up, attending public schools in Kansas City, many hours every day were spent training to be a professional ballet dancer. A few hours were squeezed out every week for horseback riding. Both occupations gave me joy, a feel for the value of discipline, and an appreciation of my own body and life movement that I shall always revel in. My only contact with the Loretto during these years was the religion classes for public school children with Sister Januarius Lysett at Good Counsel for 2 weeks each summer. Sister Jan was a loving, warm first contact. I also caught sight of Loretto sisters in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, where I spent most of my summers with my maternal aunt and uncle. Dr. Robert Barrett was a service provider on the Osage Reservation. My Aunt Harriet Barrett was great fun, almost an older sister to me. We rode horses and barnstormed across the reservation and into Kansas in her small plane. The death of the Barretts and my inheritance from them enabled me to attend Loretto Academy in Kansas City for my last 2 years of high school. The example of the sisters, a close friendship with Sister Matthew Marie Grennan, and more time to ride and be at school because a fall made it impossible for me to dance for 3 months, all resulted in my vocation to be a sister of Loretto. Sisters especially influential during these high school years were Sister Theonella Peake, gruff, honest, and faith-filled, Sister Mary Florence Wolfe, gracious, concerned, who introduced us to the history of Loretto, and Sister Mary Louise Haverhill, a clown with great courage, faith, and love for all of us. It was Sister Matthew Murray who spent hours with me, guiding my spiritual reading, helping me work through the opposition my mother had to my vocation. My mom and I had fun together, attended the ballet together, and could wear each other's clothes. But when I wanted to enter Loretto after high school, my mother did everything she could to prevent it, even invoking her status as my legal guardian until I was 21. Her stubbornness still appears in me. So I enrolled at Webster College, and Sister Matthew Marie was transferred there also. During my 4 years as a boarder, I was influenced by Father Daniel Lord and Father Adrian Corley, as well as many sisters. Those who probably influenced me the most were Sister Edmund Fern, a great lady and a classical scholar of deep faith and a delightful sense of humor, and Sister Mary Louise Buettner, a brilliant English scholar, appreciative of dance and drama. Mary Louise was as modern as Sister Edmund was classical. Their rooms were at opposite ends of Webster's main hall, symbolic of their being poles apart in so many ways. And yet both were true Lauretines and great women. And finally, Sister Frances de Chantal McLeese, a great teacher, a chemist and educator, who pushed our vision far beyond Webster College. In Pat's lengthy autobiographical remarks, you wouldn't believe I cut it, would you? Pat says little about her novitiate years, but in a letter published in the Webster College literary magazine, The Lauretine, Pat described her early months so cleverly that the letter was later republished as a small brochure. Pat entered Loretto as a postulant on June the 15th, 1945. Her father put her on the train on June 14th, her 21st birthday, still without her mother's approval. Pat received the habit on December 8th and the name Sister Marie Frances. She made her first vows 2 years later and was missioned to Loretto Academy on Lafayette in St. Louis. Her autobiography continues from that point. It was on my first mission as a teacher at Loretto Academy, Lafayette, that I met Sister Mary Luke Tobin. Some years later, when I was the Dean of Studies at Webster College, having obtained my master's at St. Louis University and my doctorate from Fordham, I faced a crisis and a growth point in my life. I was suffering from severe depression and was told quite suddenly at Christmas time that I had been given a leave to go to the Mother House. I had planned to leave the congregation at the end of the school year. While I resented the bull at Christmas, The support and understanding given me by Sister Mary Luke is responsible in God's providence, not only for my being part of Loretto today, but even for my being alive. For there were times during the next 2 years that I thought of suicide, seeing no use in my life. I was granted an exclaustration and lived in New York City for those 2 years, working as a research psychologist at the IBM Watson Research Center and renewing old acquaintances in the ballet world. I also taught a class in the graduate school at NYU. Those 2 years were a time of growth through psychotherapy and my work at IBM. Yet one of the greatest experiences of my life was my return to Loretto, warmly welcomed at the Mother House, and later by Jacqueline and my former faculty members at Webster. My next learning experience involved postdoctoral study at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, a service practicum in pastoral psychology, followed by a year as a teacher and counselor at the Jefferson Community College in Louisville. During those years, 1963 to 1970, in New York, St. Louis, Topeka, and Louisville, I was getting more and more involved in the civil rights and peace movements. While working at IBM, I had gone down to Washington for the march at which Martin Luther King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. With the inauguration of the new Loretto government in 1970, I took a position on the staff and traveled during the next 4 years, giving workshops, testing, and counseling Sisters of Loretto. I was asked by the Medical Mission Sisters to give workshops in both East and West Pakistan. Sister Mary Luke traveled with me, and on the way home, we attended the Paris Peace Conference. South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, French, and Americans. What a learning and joy-filled experience. We could not speak to each other, but we could eat and dance together. With other SLs, I have since been active in many peace demonstrations, once spending a night in a Washington, D.C. jail as a result of a protest. Besides the Loretto staff position, I have been privileged to be a member of the St. Louis Provincial Council, a delegate to special chapters, an assembly member and delegate, an executive committee member. While serving on the boards of our private high schools, I became especially interested in Loretto and Kansas City, and therefore applied and was hired as coordinator of the upper school. After 3 years in that position, I resigned to pursue related interests, more directly serving the middle and poorer classes in Kansas City. Pat's autobiography breaks off here as her active life picked up. In the late 1980s, Pat taught for 2 years at the Center for Spiritual Renewal in Kumasi, Ghana, West Africa. In Kansas City, Pat's home base, she filled administrative and organizing roles at the Metropolitan United Citizens for Prison Reform, the Nuclear Freeze Organization, the Economic Literacy Project, and Loretto's own Economic Conversion Committee. In 1991, Pat became Loretto's first non-governmental representative at the United Nations, completing a 4-year term in 1995 and serving for several more years as an alternate representative and volunteer. As the NGO rep, she was a participant in the United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro and the United Nations Social Summit in Copenhagen, Denmark. She also served on the Peace Caucus, in the Women's Caucus, and at the preparatory meetings for UN conferences on human rights, population, and women's issues. Pat lived twice at the Mother House, serving as a volunteer. She returned to the Mother House as a retiree in 2004. But 2 years later, Pat decided to return to Kansas City, and at the same time asked to be dispensed from the vowed life to which she had been faithful for 60 years. She wrote to Loretto President Mary Catherine Rabbitt, "Freedom from my vows will enable me to expend my energy as I truly want to do. I want to put my money where my mouth is, more completely depending on God as I experience the meaning of that dependence. When I get truly infirm and need care, I want to be with others who have to manage without a congregation responsible for them. To really live what I think I believe about God will provide by doing as many women my age do, riding the bus and experiencing both the inconveniences and the privileges of being on a fixed income. As you know, Mary Catherine, I still have lots of energy and lots of ideas about making things better wherever I am. I'm no leader, but I can be a helpful participant in the right place. Where I see myself best suited by gifts, interests, and limitations is in the present US political field. I've already made arrangements to volunteer in Claire McCaskill's campaign for the Senate. Just 1 year later, Pat wrote again to Mary Catherine. After a year of living without canonical vows, I know I want to continue that freedom, but I feel a need to affirm my continuing Loretto commitment, which involves relationships and accountability. Therefore, I am now requesting co-membership. Pat's co-membership was enthusiastically endorsed on July the 9th, 2007. Finally, after still very active life, in 2016, and at the urging of Loretto friends, Pat traveled again to the Mother House, believing that she could build her strength and then return to Kansas City. It was not to be. She left a final message in her records. People should celebrate my life and know how grateful I am for it.
Since Pat served as a volunteer and then as Loretto's NGO at the United Nations, it seemed fitting to read excerpts from the articles of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to equal pay for equal work. Everyone has the right to education. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace.
Let us respond with the words from One by Miriam Treese Winter. One by one, we are coming to awareness. One by one, we're committed to a cause. One by one, we are challenging the structures. One by one, we are changing the laws. Around the world, we are opening our eyes. Around the world, we confront discrimination. Around the world, we are rising up for justice. Around the world, they are hearing our cries. Women of the world, we're united in compassion. Women of the world, we are one in our pain. Women of the world, we are one in deprivation. We say, never again, never, never again. Let us pray. God of love and mercy, we give thanks for the life of Pat. We rejoice with her now as the angels greet her. Show your mercy to suffering people everywhere. Give food to the hungry, shelter to refugees, comfort to the dying. Bring peace to our world, even as you welcome Pat into your loving embrace. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Now we'll prepare for hearing some stories about Pat.
My name is Mary Peter Bruce, and above all, I am very grateful to Pat because it was she who inspired me, encouraged me, and helped me to get in touch with the United Nations. In 1980, when we had a woman march in New York and then in Washington, she encouraged me and told me that there was going to be a women's conference in 1995 and it would be good to go to it. So that's where I began getting ready for the United Nations. But it was really Pat who had obtained an office for us. It was Pat who had really built the relationships of Loretto with the United Nations. So I'm very, very grateful, Pat. Thank you.
Claudette Laporto. I was a freshman at Loretto Academy when Marie Frances came. We had Sister Michaela for Latin, and Sister Michaela was a very quiet, reserved person. But when Marie Frances came in, we all kind of sat up in our seats. She was so enthusiastic, and she said she had just come from the novitiate. So it was quite a surprise to see her so enthusiastic. And I think that probably would have encouraged most of us to think about joining the Sisters of Loretto. And of course, all the nuns at Lafayette Loretto Academy were great anyway. But anyway, I just thought I mentioned that. But she also taught us general science. And I don't know how those two got together, but we did. But she was a great teacher.
Dory Kincaid, Carol Eschen, Eleanor Craig, Barbara Doak, and Mary McNellis, and I all lived in Pat Kenoyer's family house. And typical of Pat, she gave that property to the Sisters of Loretto on one condition, namely that we pay taxes. So that's just typical of Pat. The other thing I'd like to mention is a story Pat told about herself. She was living in an assisted living apartment. I forget now just exactly what it was, but anyway, it was basically housed by Black people, and she was very, very popular there too with the residents of that place. But anyway, one day she said that she met one of the men in the lobby, and she said, you know, at the neighborhood bar, they're going to have a musical performance tonight. That sounds really good. Would you like to go? And he said, oh, sure. What time? She said, about 7 o'clock. So he said, oh, good. Well, I'll meet you here at 7. So Pat at 7 o'clock goes down, and this gentleman's standing there, and she said, come on, let's go. And he said, well, where are we going? She said, don't you remember we're going to go down to the bar? And he said, oh, yeah, okay. So off they go, and they get in the bar. Well, after time passed, he began to drink too much alcohol. So she left and came back home. And when she came in the front door, there was a man standing there and said, well, you're a fine one. I was here. Why didn't you come? So that's kind of typical, but Pat was just open to everybody and everything. And we worried about her a little bit in Kansas City when I lived there, because she'd be on the streets at any hour of the night. But she was, no matter who was on the street, the homeless or whatever, you know, she was there to say hi and call them by name and just live for the moment.
I'm Maureen Smith, and there's so many things I want to say about Pat, but I don't want you listening to me till morning. So I had a wonderful inspiration before I came. I was sitting in St. Mary's Haven after Pat had had her serious stroke, and she was very frustrated. And she was sitting at the end table facing east, and the other side of St. Mary's Haven was facing west. And she was screaming raise the blinds, raise the blinds, raise the blinds. And everybody was getting frustrated. And staff was trying to say, Pat, the blinds are all the way up. Raise the blinds. And I walked in there today and I thought, what Pat was saying was, get rid of those, what do you call them? You know, the curtains that are on the top of windows, shams. Take down those shams so the sun can come in. And the only way we could have done it was get a ladder and tools, but she just insisted. And I thought that was Pat's life, insisting that we open windows, that we let us see each other. She didn't want the rich not to have margaritas. She wanted the rich to have all the margaritas they needed. And she wanted the poor to have all the margaritas they needed. And so she wanted us to see each other and love each other and care about each other. And to me, her wanting to take down the curtains was the same as wanting to take down the Iron Curtain, not wanting to build the black wall. Just open so we can all love one another and see the beauty of one another. So I thank you for that lesson, Pat.
Well, we all know Pat had so many, gave us so many gifts during her life. And certainly for me, one of them was she was going to our sisters in Chile during our first year there. And she asked me to go with her. So that was a wonderful experience with them. I remember we arrived, I guess Christmas Eve or something. They were having all sorts of little parties on the streets of the poblacion. And so we went with the community, which was fairly large at that point. It was the early days. And so they would give us a little wine and a little treat. You know, if you knew Pat very well, she had great energy, but she needed to eat. And if she didn't get her food, it was very hard for her. And I remember thinking, I think I'm going to end up carrying her as we went from street to street to street. But it was a wonderful experience with her. Another one was, I can't think of the name of the place in Kansas. Well, it starts with an M. Anyway, she worked there. And so that was another time I was with her. But the best was, of course, many experiences at the UN. And one occasion, we came up from the subway onto a very icy street in New York, and Pat slipped and fell. And so I'm trying to help her get up, you know, but her legs kept, you know, going this way and that way. And then she would start laughing, and she'd lose all power. You know, she couldn't move her legs or anything because she was laughing so hard. And we're working together to get her up on her feet, but couldn't do it. So it went on for quite a while. And either I was struggling, you know, and she was doing all these dances that she was doing on her, with her feet. And then we get to laughing again. So anyway, finally, I did get her up, and then I was holding on to her, and we turned around, and there had been a bus that had been stopped there, and all the people that were at the windows were laughing and cheering for us that we would manage to get up. But she was a wonderful gift at so many times, just personally, and certainly the introduction at times with her at the UN. And as you know, Pat was not shy about, you know, standing up and with people from any times that she was there. So it's just like Peter said, it was a great gift. That was one of the gifts that she gave us, one of the many.
This story goes back to the late 1950s when Pat, then known as Marie Frances, and I were both at Webster. And at that time, the sisters were just beginning to drive. And so Pat and I were sent to go down and get our driver's licenses. We went together to a little place in Maplewood. We're in full habit, you have to understand, and it's a rainy day outside, but there we were. So we walked in, and you had to take the written first. So Pat was ahead of me, and she went up and got her paper, and the woman, she said she was Marie Frances, and the woman said, "No, I'll have to have your regular name." And so she said, "Well, my name is Patricia Ann Kenoyer." So the woman gave her the paper, sent her off to take the test. I came along next, and I'd heard that conversation. So I told the woman, "My name is Patricia Ann Doyle." And so she gave me my paper, and I went back to take the test. So I was about 3 rows behind Pat in the seating while we were taking the test. So they called Pat first, and Patricia Ann Kenoyer. But as soon as they said Patricia Ann, I stood up also. But she didn't know that because I was behind her. So she went up and then was sent out to take the driving. And the woman then called me, and Pat was still in the room. And the woman said to her, "Are both of you girls named Patricia Ann?" And of course, Marie Frances had not heard. And she said, "Remember, we're in full habit, we came in together." She says, "Well, my name's Patricia Ann, but I don't know what her name is."
Nancy Whitwer. Well, well, I have never experienced so many emails at the time of Pat Kenoyer's death. There must have been about 25 emails of people from all over the country sending emails of their memories and their experience with Pat Kenoyer. Well, I later decided I already had knocked them off of my computer. I thought, I'm going to save those because those are really precious. And there's not time for me to share all of them with you. But one I have singled out. This one is written by Mary Louise Denny. And I figured she wouldn't be here, obviously, and nor would she probably be listening. So I called her today and said, "Denny, would you be comfortable with my sharing your reflection?" And she said, "Oh, sure, go do it." So here it goes. I better put my glasses on. I was on the women's team mid-'80s. Mid-'80s, I think. Pat, Virginia Williams, Lydia Pena, Kathy Muller, and I. We met together every few months. Pat wanted to try and meet telepathically at one meeting. We agreed, and at the appointed hour and date, we each sat in our homes, concentrating very hard
on the work of the women's team? Well, when we checked with each other about the experience, needless to say, we were a flop at telepathic communication. Pat loved trying it, and we all loved Pat. She would stop by our house sometimes in her VW Bug. She loved getting on her CB, breaker. She slept on our floor, ate an onion sandwich in the morning before starting out again. She called me when she was moving to Loretto this last time, just to say that she knew she had dementia and wanted to tell me how much she had valued our friendship. That meant a lot to me. So, Pat, I send you love telepathically. I think it will work this time. Anyway, well, I personally have such fond memories of Pat. It was 1992 that I had made the decision to leave teaching, and I was on Maureen's McCormick's staff, charged kind of with getting the earth issues front and center. Well, that was the same time when Pat was taking on the United Nations. And so, of course, she's going to go to the Earth Summit in 1992. And guess what? She arranged for me and a number of other people who had no connection with the community, but she was always finding people she wanted to bring in. And so a group of us went off to Rio for the very first World Summit, Earth Summit, we called it. And then another thing she did for me was, of course, to get me to come to the United Nations. And that was both of those were just wonderful experiences for me since I was just newly diving into all of these issues. So she was a great gift to me and to so many of us.
Kathleen Vonderhaar. I'm back in the, what IT? Lower it? Back in the 80s, there was a committee called the Nuclear Disarmament and Conversion Committee. And Pat was on that committee, PJ, Luke, DJ, all these fine minds. But here's Pat, and she would come in and her ideas would they were nonstop. And it was like, well, what do you do with all this? You know, she had ideas. She was so bright. And she knew every senator and every politician. And she had all these great ideas. But she was balanced by DJ, because DJ had a historical knowledge of Palestine. And so we would have these lively meetings. And it would be PJ who would end up doing the writing. And together, they did great work. And so, and one of the results, like Nancy was saying, she wanted us to go to Russia, to the Soviet Union. And so I got to go with PJ. And so I'm very grateful for that. But that committee had so many ideas. It was very alive. Great work.
Well, that's fun. Maureen McCormick. Thanks. Well, I was president of the community at the time that we appointed Pat to be the first NGO at the UN. And it was a great choice because Pat being so enthusiastic and talking to everybody and bringing in everybody. So, I mean, it was really a great start for us to have NGO reps at the United Nations. But anyway, also I was, I think you remember the song, I Left My Heart in San Francisco. Well, Pat left her heart in Kansas City. And I understand that there is a large gathering of people gathered in Kansas City watching this and participating. We hope they'll participate actively when they get a chance. But I say a real shout out to all her friends in Kansas City who she loved so dearly. So anyway, thank you all very much.
I think we can go now to other places.
If anyone on Zoom wishes to share, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself and then begin speaking.
Hi, this is Mary Catherine Rabbit in Denver. Mary Kay Brannon is with me. I had a wonderful experience with Pat in the early 70s. We were going to a peace conference at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and all four of us were to meet in Chicago. And it was Luke, Mary Nell Gage, Pat, and me. Now Pat was driving her little bug, and Luke was in the front seat. Mary Nell and I in the back. So Luke leans back and says, "Okay, you two, start singing those songs from when you were growing up." So we started doing every Motown song we could think of, and with gestures and everything that we could think of. Well, Pat got so excited that she, of course, hit the accelerator a little too hard. And we were wandering down the Michigan freeways, and all of a sudden behind us, we hear the siren and see the flashing lights of a policeman, of a state patrolman. So he comes up to her window, and she rolls down the window politely, and he says, "Ma'am, do you have any idea how fast you were going?" And she said, "No, officer, why don't you tell me?" So he says, "Nearly 90 miles an hour." Now, this was during the Jimmy Carter era, when, remember, the speed limit nationally was alive at 55. So we're in the back calculating the price of this ticket. And she just disarmed this officer and charmed him. And we got off, but he did say, "Keep the speed limit." And she said, "Yes, officer, thank you."
Nice. You can see.
I'm Lydia Pena. Pat, I'm sitting here at Bridge with Mary Kay Widger and Maria Vissi, who is visiting with us the way you used to. In 1983, Pat contacted me and said, Lydia, you know, they're starting a home for developmentally disabled women. Sue Rogers and Mary Kay Widger and Larry Freeman. And they need some of us to be there to give them a little moral support and financial support. So several of us came. And Pat, I just want to say thank you. It's been a wonderful teaching experience for me, learning experience, learning for 34 years. Thank you.
Anyone else on Zoom? Would you like to speak?
Yeah, I would like to. This is Lillian Moskland in Ohio. And when we were young, much younger, and I can't remember the date, Pat took us, we visited at Loretto, and she says, we've got to take you a very special place. So she took us down to Churchill Downs and walked us all over and explained everything. And we ended up upstairs, I believe, where there were a lot of displays, and she showed us through there. And then at the end of her time, when she was at the Mother House just recently, so that it was the beginning of our visits and toward the end of the time that we were there, she decided that she knew that John was born on an island. So she called him her islander. And she would, when we would go to visit, she was taking John by the arm and walking off with him. And she turned around and she says, you don't mind, do you? And I said, no, not absolutely not. He was her islander. And lo and behold, about a month before she was getting even more and more forgetful, I received a letter, and on it, it was decorated totally with island wear, with ships and anchors, and it was a letter from Pat to John, reminding him that he was her islander.
Anyone else? Kathy Smith, if you're talking, I cannot hear you. Would anyone else like to share? Okay, back to you, Mother House.
I invite all of us and all of you who are participating via Zoom to stand and sing "We Shall Overcome" in honor of all the many causes, protests, and marches that Pat participated in throughout her life,
while standing and speaking out to overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. So, we shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. Thank you, Pat.
Hey, Kathy, try talking now. Still nothing. Is the correct microphone checked? Like if you go to that little thing, you know, ah. I still can't hear you. I think you said, oh, well. Okay, I'm going to end the meeting now.